Welcome back, everyone, to The Damage, where I'm John Iadarola, only at a slightly different angle. And anyway, today we've got a big show planned. Not only do we have Jordan Uhl joining us once again, a progressive activist and friend of the show, who's gonna help break down some of the news of the day. A new campaign, or new career path for Rudy Giuliani, and also we're right on the cusp of the public impeachment hearings beginning. So we're gonna be breaking that down, some of our predictions about how it might go and how various parties to this might respond. We've also got Ken Klippenstein, who's gonna be joining us once again to break down his most recent reporting, this time around investigations of those doing activism around border-related issues. We've got a candidate joining us, and the billionaires strike back against progressive tax proposals, including wealth proposal, continues. Leon Cooperman is being asked some tough questions about his previous teary-eyed performances in the media. We're gonna be breaking that down. But before all of that, we're gonna be starting off with a little bit of a preview of the defense of the Republicans that you might see at these impeachment hearings. So we're gonna start there. How will the Republicans respond to all this information that's gonna be coming out during the public impeachment hearings? Well, we do have an idea. It came out of a new memo laying out 4 pieces of evidence that the Republicans are using to defend Donald Trump. This is coming, by the way, after the revelation earlier today that Donald Trump is going to be releasing another transcript like the first one. He says, "I will be releasing the transcript of the first and therefore more important phone call with the Ukrainian president before week's end." So a couple quick questions about that. One, why is it necessarily more important? I don't know, maybe it will be. It kind of seems like the early calls aren't necessarily as important as after you've had an opportunity to build up the relationship, you've had more overtures between your diplomatic team and their government, but he's implying this is more important for some reason. I'm gonna guess it's a self-interested reason, but we will of course find out. Also, if it's so important that we get this information, why have we waited months to find out what's in it, and why can't you just release it now? It's literally a document, you can upload it from your phone. Why does it have to wait until the end of the week? I don't know. By the time we finally read it, perhaps we'll have an explanation as to why they decided to wait until after a few days of public testimony. At this point, we don't know. But that testimony is coming, and here is what the defense is gonna look like. Republicans argue in the memo I alluded to that the summary of a July 25th call between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, quote, shows no conditionality or evidence of pressure, according to the memo, which is obtained by The Hill, but first reported by Axios. So, a couple things there. One, it's not true. The fact that he says, we need you to do us a favor, though is a conditional statement. It implies that, sure, the thing you said, but I'm gonna need this first. That's what it implies. More importantly, though, this call transcript summary needs to be put in the context of everything on this timeline of what's been revealed, both before and after the transcript was revealed. We've had lots of testimony from a number of different individuals, and all of that makes very clear the conditionality. Also, the fact that they didn't give the aid until seemingly they were on the cusp of that Zelensky interview on CNN being done. That was cut off by the fact that we found out about this whole scandal. So it's a pretty bold thing to say no one thought there would be any conditionality when, first of all, multiple people have already testified that the closest aides to Zelensky understood that it was conditional and that they didn't actually get the aid until we found out about the whole scandal. But that's just the first of their 4 different arguments. According to GOP House members, evidence supporting Trump also includes, quote, President Zelensky and President Trump have both said there was no pressure on the call. The Ukrainian government was not aware of a hold on US security assistance at the time of a July 25th call. And President Trump met with President Zelensky and US security assistance flowed to Ukraine in September 2019, both of which occurred without Ukraine investigating President Trump's political rivals. All of that would be very convincing if that was the first thing you had heard about any of this. If you have actually been paying attention to this case as developments have come in day after day, as testimonies happen and more people have revealed what they knew, not second and third hand information as Donald Trump likes to imply, but people who were at the meetings, on the calls, doing the overtures, setting up the relationship with their Ukrainian counterparts, none of this makes any sense. So let's go through it point by point. President Zelensky and President Trump have both said there was no pressure on the call. That is technically true, they've both said that. but it's irrelevant. If we believe that you two are involved in a corrupt relationship, whether it's an actual quid pro quo or more accurately, Donald Trump is extorting you for aid in his reelection bids, I don't trust you to be honest about that at this point. Donald Trump definitely can't just be trusted on his word to say what was actually happening there. And if Zelensky did actually understand the conditionality, which we're gonna lay out, then of course he's still worried about whether he's gonna get continued aid. He doesn't want to ruin that relationship with a guy who could be president for 5 more years. And so he too can't simply be trusted on his word when there's so much at stake. He's facing a conflict, a military conflict inside of his country that's already killed more than 13,000 people. He's got other things to worry about potentially. But that's just the first point. The second point, the Ukrainian government was not aware of a hold on US security assistance at the time of the July 25th call. That might not be true, but it seems a little bit less important when you realize that after that point, for literally months, the aid was held. So whether they realized it at the time of the call, more time went by, week after week after week. Eventually, Zelensky decides, okay, fine, I'll do the Fareed Zakaria interview that you want me to do where I'm gonna pretend to spontaneously come up with this investigation of Joe Biden, all the while knowing that it had been held for literally months at that point. Why should we care if on July 25th they knew that it was being held? It sure became clear to them as time went on. And furthermore, President Trump met with President Zelensky and US security assistance flowed to Ukraine in September 2019, both of which occurred without Ukraine investigating President Trump's political rivals. That's inaccurate and irrelevant. So the aid did eventually flow to Ukraine after this entire scandal was revealed, after we found out about the whistleblower. They had held the aid for literally months until the entire thing blew up in their face. And so in a rush to create some plausible deniability, they did release the aid, sure, but they held it for months, something that they were not supposed to do under the law in the first place. And to say it was done without Ukraine investigating President Trump's political rivals, that is absolute nonsense. As we already said, President Zelensky had scheduled an interview on CNN with Fareed Zakaria where he was going to announce that he was investigating Joe Biden. So yes, he didn't in the end do it so far as we know, but he was 100% going to do it. The interview was already scheduled. The only reason it didn't happen is because the whistleblower blew the whistle and the whole thing blew up in their face, as I said. And so all of these points are absolute nonsense. And what they rely on for anyone to buy them is for you to have not been paying attention, to have the water be muddied along the way by night after night of ridiculous interviews on Fox News, and the continuing shifting of the goalposts by Donald Trump and his defenders along the way. That's the only way that any of this makes any sense whatsoever. And I guess if it's this or no defense at all, you're gonna go with this. But considering all that's already come out, which is now gonna be public, it's one thing for someone to go behind closed doors and then quotes to leak out. But when you have the videotape of the actual, like the testimony that we're gonna see from Vinland and Sondland and all of that, that is going to be devastating when played on repeat. And this sort of flimsy, ridiculous attempt at a defense of Donald Trump is not going to hold up under all of that. They're gonna have to come up with something else. Okay, we're gonna take a short break. We come back, Jordan Yule's gonna be joining us. We'll be breaking down a little bit more on impeachment and the other news of the day after this.
We need to talk about a relatively new show called Unveils the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of Unveils the Republic, or UNFTR, the host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be, featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity. The UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, "You must unlearn what you have learned." And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFTR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
If you've been wondering where Rudy Giuliani is, apparently behind the scenes, he's been doing a little bit of work and his career is gonna be moving in a new direction now. He's doing basically what every hip young millennial is doing, launching a podcast. Giuliani is considering re-entering the impeachment fray by launching a podcast to provide impeachment analysis. Giuliani was overheard discussing the plans with an unidentified woman while at a crowded New York City restaurant. I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming the unidentified woman will be his co-host, and so we can begin to speculate about who it might be. But anyway, joining us now to talk about this and other topics, campaign director for Media Matters, Jordan Ewell. Welcome back to the show.
John, thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. So Giuliani's podcast, what do you think? Is it a potential winner?
No, this is just like, a perfect example of how everybody who's connected to the Trump administration, the Trump family and the campaign is just looking to cash in new and different ways. I mean, this is probably the last person who should be leading a podcast. The guy is very incoherent. His Fox appearances are always very unwieldy and rambling. Sure, let's let this guy down in front of a mic for an hour and have him talk about one of the most important and pressing and critical legal matters and very sensitive issues. This is a guy who is butt dialing reporters and talking about sensitive information while on the phone, texting his password to reporters. I honestly thought it was a joke when I saw this headline yesterday. I don't know about you, but I thought it was an Onion article.
Yeah, well, apparently it is authentic. People at the restaurant had audio recordings of it happening or whatever, which that gets into a little bit. Don't audio record people, but I am interested to find out about it. Now, that does not mean that he's going to end up actually doing the podcast, but as you point out, it could well be about cashing in. We know from the butt dial that he needs money. He hasn't yet stooped to the point of doing. He doesn't have a Patreon. He's not doing cameos as far as I know, but there could be money in it. I mean, he's a high-profile ally of the president, and for a certain type of right-wing person, maybe that'll be appealing. Maybe they will want to get his take as the day-by-day of this impeachment inquiry goes forward.
Right. I think there's a market for just about any semi-important or semi-well-known figure on the right to do some sort of media output, right? Whether it's writing a book and in the industry tactics used by the publishers to artificially boost those book sales up to a bestseller status, to a podcast. I mean, he's gonna have the reach, he's gonna have the connections to guests, he would have the connections to a wide listener base, and his Fox appearances are a good opportunity to kind of hawk those products. As you see, whenever a right-wing figure goes on Fox, they're there plugging something, whether it's their podcast, whether it's their new book, whatever. This is the way he would promote that and reach a new listener base, and from there he could get ad revenue or subscriptions or whatever his tactic is.
Yeah, I would tell him from my own personal experience, I can say the podcast thing is, there's a lot of them. That's a lot of competition. I think he should get into Let's Plays. Death Stranding's really big. Maybe he could do some commentary over that. But anyway, you brought up the book, so actually, we'll get back to Giuliani in a second, but I recently learned that John Bolton has a book deal, and apparently he's gonna get more than $1 million for it. I'm assuming it's because they think, oh, this is gonna be the one. We keep thinking the next book is gonna sink Trump. Maybe John Bolton has insider information that's gonna really hurt him. What do you think is gonna end up happening with this book?
I mean, a couple things, right? This pipe dream that some Trump official is going to, tell all and finally take down Trump is just purely fantasy. And this is also a guy who's talked openly about how he doesn't want to criticize sitting presidents. He doesn't think that's appropriate. He's a process guy. He's like an old legacy DC guy. That's not going to happen. What they do is they'll put a few tantalizing details in these books, and then they'll use those to give in advance copies, and they'll put that in the press release about a week before these things drop to create buzz around it. If you remember the Fire and Fury, it was just basically like in all of these books that have come out from former White House officials, it's like it's a White House in disarray, it's chaotic, whatever. And that's their selling point. And we get nothing new, nothing really substantive. It's just, we all know that. If you just like look for 5 seconds, you could tell the White House is in complete disarray. So we're probably not going to get anything new. Yeah. But it also highlights how willing people are to rehabilitate the image of absolute monsters.
Yes.
This is a guy who is just a complete warmonger and has been for years, has had his hands on deaths of hundreds of thousands of people around the world for years. And sure, let's give him a book deal. Let's welcome him back gracefully into society.
Yeah. Look, he's well connected. That's one of the reasons you do this, is so that you can give speeches and do books. I find the idea of a person sitting down and reading the closing chapter of John Bolton's book to be impossible to conjure up. Like the idea that I know they'll sell them or whatever, but who's actually reading one of these books? Anyway, apparently it happens. One other thing about Giuliani, though, in that conversation about the podcast, which we'll wait and see if that launches. I'm assuming if it does, it'll be pretty soon. Giuliani was also mentioning 2 op-eds for major newspapers he was planning on publishing. The first of which would explain why Trump is unimpeachable, and the second offering an explanation of Giuliani's defense of his client, which I just love that you feel you need to do a write-up to explain what you've been trying to accomplish as you've defended the guy you work for. Amazing. But anyway, as the Giuliani stuff is going on, we also have tomorrow launches the public impeachment inquiry. So I know a lot of people are really wondering, is this going to be a game changer? Is the public actually going to tune in? Is this going to fundamentally change the calculations for Republicans in the future? They've been very hesitant to condemn Trump in even the lightest terms, but now it's going to be public. Is it possible that that will break through to any of them?
I hope this breaks through. What we're going to see tomorrow, we'll see Bill Taylor especially, who has testified behind closed doors, that there was pressure put on him by the Trump administration to use this military aid as leverage in his negotiations with Ukraine. We're going to see. I was thinking about this earlier, right? So this is career civil servants. These are people who aren't necessarily directly beholden to the Trump administration. They weren't really Trump campaign loyalists, and this web of corruption and influence has finally hit career civil servants and people who have nothing to gain by defending Trump. And the Trump administration, through this kind of artificial reality that they've conjured up through, only consuming flattering coverage from Fox and assuming that like every Republican loves Trump, they now think that these people who have everything to lose by defending him will also just lie for him, fall on the sword for him, and just take one for the team. And we're not going to see that from Taylor. The issue is whether that will actually matter to Republicans. House Republicans, that's kind of a done deal. It's just more of a formality at this point. They've got the votes in the House. Mm-hmm. But Senate Republicans, I don't know if they'll actually listen, because we've seen them move the goalposts repeatedly. We've seen people like Lindsey Graham, issue a new proclamation for what constitutes a reasonable and legitimate impeachment inquiry. And his thing now is we need to name the whistleblower. That's just like it's I don't know, goes against everything we stand for public accountability in government, whistleblower protections. But it sets the bar incredibly high, so he doesn't actually have to engage on a substantive level.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you mentioned the naming the whistleblower thing. They've been obsessed with that. That's the Fox News coverage. I have to put together hour-long rundowns every day. I don't know how you do a rundown of they need to name the whistleblower night after night after night, but Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham have done that. So they've got name the whistleblower, they've got read the transcript, which none of them appear to have done. I wonder, from your point of view, is this convincing to right-wingers or perhaps right-leaning independents who are watching this thing, where on the one hand, we have all of these new sets of testimony over the past few weeks. You had Vinland and Taylor and Sondland changed his prior statement and confirms a quid pro quo. So all of this is going on, developing more and more. We find out about the Fareed Zakaria interview that had been scheduled for Zelensky. And then on the other side, you just have name the whistleblower, read the transcript over and over and over, as if none of that was happening. Do you think that that is actually going to be successful, that they can keep people bewildered through the entirety of this process?
I mean, that's a good point. So the right wing has done a great job over the past few decades of really boiling down these complex issues into like really digestible talking points. And you've seen tons of polling. Karl Rove was instrumental in this. You've seen polling from different folks and how they construe these issues to the general public. This is a lot to keep up with, and I maybe you do as well, but I struggle to keep up with it in the day-to-day level. How do we expect someone who this isn't really connected to their full-time job to follow this on a very granular level? Even on the Ukraine front, this military aid, there's like more to it than just, hey, can you do me a favor on this call? This is because they were like reliant on this aid, and that has been completely lost in media coverage. Mm-hmm. They really needed that, and they had a political power position, and they were leveraging that for political gain because Ukraine is at conflict with Russia, and that aid isn't just something that would be nice to have. They like needed it immediately, and they relied on it to in their fight with Russian separatists and with Russia. That never really gets translated. Like there's a complete power dynamic that the Trump administration exploited. The New York Times reported last week that Ukraine was ready to make that concession to get this aid because they were so desperate for it, and the whistleblower, raising their concerns and the whistleblower report saved them. It gave them a little bit of a buffer room to fight back against what they knew was ultimately a political ploy. Yeah, it was ultimately extortion. And I was talking earlier in the show about the White House, the Republican memo laying out some of their points of defense for Trump, saying, for instance, that the aid was eventually given, and it was done without Ukraine ever formally launching the investigations. But with the CNN interview being scheduled, and the fact that they only released the aid once the whistleblower account had come out, to me, it seems unconvincing that at some point, maybe the 32% of the country that loves Donald Trump more than their own family, they'll stick with him. But for reasonable people, it feels like at that point, how can you possibly deny that this extortion was successful when the interview was being set up, like they were figuring out what the set was going to look like it was all ready to go? Yeah, I think we've seen in past elections, even ambiguous claims of corruption and misdeed can tank a candidate. We'll see. We saw with Kentucky how Trump wasn't able to get Bevin across the finish line. That should have been a fairly safe election. I mean, I realize Bevin was unpopular, but in other circumstances, a very popular president could have gotten him across the finish line. The issue I think now people need to look at is whether Trump is just ultimately dead weight for these politicians, and who is going to start distancing themselves from him as we go into an election year next year. I gotta imagine some people will be keeping him at arm's length, similar to how some Democrats do with Pelosi. They just feel like it's not safe to have him around. We could see like a fracture in the Republican electorate. It'd be curious to see. Yeah, I don't necessarily expect it, but it certainly is possible. Jordan Ewell, as always, thank you so much for joining us. John, thank you for having me. We're gonna take a short break here. When we come back, Ken Klippenstein at TYT Investigates will be here to break down his most recent reporting. If you're an activist who's been working near the southern border, perhaps around child imprisonment, migrant issues, things of that sort, there is a possibility the military itself has been tracking your activities, and we found out about this thanks to the great investigative reporting work of Ken Klippenstein, who joins us now on the Ambridge Report. Ken, welcome back.
Hey, John, how you doing?
Great to have you here. So tell us about this reporting, which you co-published with TYT and The Intercept, correct?
That's right, yeah. What I found based on a commander's update briefing was that the Pentagon has been getting what are called situation updates. This is supposedly for situational awareness, about a number of different events. But what caught my eye was that some of them were totally nonviolent, peaceful protests in opposition to President Trump's border policies, specifically in the cases that I saw, family separation, and also demonstrations in front of ICE detention facilities.
So you mentioned there that some of them are nonviolent, but I would imagine for whole categories of this, like you talked about, like child separation and things like that, is there any violence? Is there any reason that these groups would be investigated by law enforcement, let alone by the military itself?
Well, what I thought was shocking about it was they were listed alongside a number of threats that certainly would be violent, what are called TCOs, transnational criminal organizations. These are things like drug gangs and stuff. And next to those, you see listed, again, it's a threat assessment. I linked to the document, or I embed the document in the article, which I would encourage people to go and look at. They, list these 3 events, and I, assume there must be some sort of violent component to it, because why else would they list them next to these, drug gangs? But when I actually looked up the specifics of these events, because they don't actually name them, because there are certain protections that American citizens enjoy, and also the military is not supposed to, there are limits on what the military is supposed to do on domestic soil. When I sort of correlated the details of these events and looked into them, they seemed largely peaceful, and even ones where they called them anti-border policy extremists. These seem to emphasize civil disobedience, things of that nature that I don't think any reasonable person would associate with violence or criminality.
So in this document, was there anything that got into a potential justification for any of these groups or all of these groups to be investigated in the way that they were?
Well, what was interesting is at the bottom of them, it has a number of questions, and it almost looked like some sort of rote assignment you'd have in junior high or something, where you just have to answer some questions and move on to the next thing. And in fact, the folks I know in the Pentagon, a lot of them don't seem to take the border deployment very seriously. Recall that pursuant to President Trump's emergency declaration on declaring undocumented immigration national emergency, that has endowed the military with all sorts of extraordinary abilities to operate on domestic soil. One of which, of course, is intelligence collection. Mm-hmm. What that all shows is that. So if you look at the threat assessment at the bottom, there's a number of questions that are like, what is the threat posed by anarchists? What is the threat posed by border policy extremists? And it was like they're being prompted to go and find either justification or explanation for these different things that I assume were coming to them from some superior.
Perhaps unrelated to this, but there's obviously been militia activity at the border for some time. Groups that go down there, like literally specifically to stop migrants from crossing the border. There have been cases of murders and things of that sort. Was there an assessment of that sort of activity, of these militias from the interior of the United States heading down to the border, potentially to commit crimes?
Yeah, that's what's so amazing to me is that the document appeared to equate those two things. So it lists these militia groups and has very interesting specifics, the number of them, where they're located, what state, so on and so forth. And these are actually, very, these are groups that will, with some regularity, engage in violence and, serious criminal conduct. So it makes perfect sense to me that they'd be monitoring those groups. But I was just surprised that they were put sort of on a footing with these other groups that I can't find any evidence that they were engaged in any sort of criminal or violent activity.
And I believe in that same document there was a reference to fears that some of the caravans that have received a lot of press attention over the past few years, especially from Fox News, that they might be infiltrated by some sort of international either criminal organization or terrorist group. What was the assessment on that area?
That's right. It was almost hard for me to keep a straight face while I was reading that. I should note that the folks in the Pentagon feel similarly, that at least the ones that I know, they think a lot of this is ridiculous. But they actually assessed the migrant caravan for, penetration by foreign terrorist organizations and recruitment by foreign intelligence services, which is just, it was a lot of poor Hondurans, if you look at it,
Yeah.
The notion, and President Trump and the vice president as well tried to push this idea that they actually said Middle Easterners had infiltrated these groups. So it does appear that this is coming from the White House.
Yeah, they seem to have mixed up the fact that they can't necessarily tell these groups apart with the idea that a bunch of people from Guatemala can't tell if some guy from Saudi Arabia is just hiding out in their group. I think they could tell. And there was one other thing though, in terms of, we have the investigation, which obviously seems ridiculous, but in terms of the methods they used, there seems to be some indication that in terms of their tracking of the group's membership over time, that they might be using social media, Facebook events, something like that.
I think that's right. If you look at the notations, the way they sort of describe changes, +1 to people showing interest, +-1 to people intending to show up, that appears to reflect the language that's used by Facebook group stuff, and these are things that they're actually authorized under President Trump's declaration, and then also how the military sort of operates overseas. That those would be things that law enforcement typically collects, but now we have a case where the military is doing it, and that's as an expert explains in the story, is what's particularly concerning.
And so you say that it's concerning, but to the best of our knowledge, is it illegal? Is this something that should be pursued to find out whether they were actually violating people's constitutional rights and how they were collecting this information?
That depends on how far they went. Of course, I only have a snapshot from that particular document. I would guess that what was alluded to in the document was legal, but that's sort of the problem. Is that once you have an emergency declaration and permit the military to do things on domestic soil, which again, there are specifically laws against, because that has a corrosive effect on civil society and civil liberties. The fact that it's legal is sort of the problem now. I mean, do we want to have the military doing these things?
Yeah. Well, Ken, as always, really appreciate your work there. Great find here.
Great to talk to you, man.
Thank you. We're gonna take a short break. When we come back, congressional candidate's gonna be joining us to break down her candidacy, but also the issue of homelessness in Texas after this. Joining us now is congressional candidate for Texas 25th District, Heidi Sloan. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Thank you so much.
Glad to have you here. So you are running in a congressional district in the Austin area, correct?
That's right. It is in the Austin area and is about a 4.5-hour swath right through the heart of Texas.
Okay, there you go. Now, you background-wise, you've been an activist around the homelessness issue. That's correct?
That's right. Both in my organizing life and in my professional life have worked alongside people experiencing homelessness for the last 8 years.
So I lived in Austin for a number of years while I was going to grad schools, and I knew even at that point, and this is a bit ago, that homelessness was a significant issue. And I think that nationally, when the issue gets talked about, generally we focus on like the San Francisco area, the LA area, New York potentially, but it is significant throughout the country. And so what has that work been like for you, and how do you feel it's prepared you for political office?
Right. So the issue of homelessness, like so many of the issues that we are up against on a federal level, is highly intersectional. In Austin, an extremely disproportionate amount of people experiencing homelessness are Black people and brown people. And while in Austin, generally the population of Black people is actually shrinking, the population of people experiencing homelessness who are Black is going up. In addition to that, we know that homelessness is related to access to healthcare, access to education, wages that keep up with the cost of living. And so knowing individuals who have experienced chronic homelessness, people who have been on the streets for 10 or 20 or 30 years at a time, and seeing how all of those factors have come into a play in their individual lives has really prepared me to go out and to drive towards systemic solutions to this problem, rather than saying that homelessness is just an issue of affordable housing, which we know that has a lot to do with it. Homelessness, especially chronic homelessness, which is a significant number of the people who we see under overpasses and in tents around Austin, is so much more than that. It has everything to do with a system that seeks to profit off of people and has this race to the bottom that does so much harm to the most vulnerable among us.
So in your activist work, you've been doing what you can to help out these people, these communities. If you were to make it into Congress, what sort of legislation would you be pushing for to potentially fix the problem in Austin and in other parts of the US?
Yeah, so I like this question, and yet at the same time, I'm going to push back just a little bit, because I think we can do so much on the way to Congress, and we have been. For the last 2 years, I have been organizing with people across the state of Texas to pursue Medicare for all, single payer healthcare, where we are all in the same system and can move from that space towards equity, is one of the largest determining factors in how long people experience homelessness, how much harm that they experience during that process, and how quickly we can recover, both for those who have fallen deeply, deeply through the cracks and for the rest of the working class as well. In addition to healthcare, of course, we're working on housing. We are pushing for affordable housing options here in Austin, and also understanding that at a local level, we really bump up against some. In the state of Texas, for example, the legislature has preempted work that was done by housing organizers a number of years ago in Austin. The organizers were pushing for non-discrimination laws against vouchers. So people could move into apartments and homes and use vouchers without someone saying they can't move in because of the source of income. Well, the state of Texas has preempted that, and they said that discrimination on income is totally acceptable here, which is another reason why we push up to the top, up to the federal and the universal level, to make sure that we are building as strong of a campaign for housing as a human right as possible. We're talking to our neighbors right now about things like rent control, which I don't think anyone in Texas has really pushed for previously, but is extremely popular door to door, especially as everyone is feeling the squeeze here locally.
Well, look, we might have gotten into it a little bit with some of the proposals you suggested there, but in terms of your ideology, your background, you're a member of the DSA. How would you describe yourself politically? What part of the Democratic Party would you say that you reside in?
That's a great question. And this race has really helped me to think through that. I like when we talk about Democratic versus Republican to also make sure that we are thinking three-dimensionally, and also talking about whether we are advocating on behalf of the poor and the working class, or advocating for those who are in power right now, and for business as usual in the top 1% made up of the millionaires and the billionaires. And so while I am a Democrat running on the Democratic ticket and pushing that as far to what we would call the left as possible, what I am ultimately trying to do is draw a distinction between policies that come from people who have existing and hegemonic power in our country, towards policies that are stemming directly from the grassroots leadership of the working class. I'm a democratic socialist, and for me, that means that I am constantly pursuing the democratic voice of all people, whether it is at the ballot, which is extremely important, of course, and we should be expanding access to the ballot and to voting rights, especially for those who have been justice impacted in our country. But also, I believe in democracy in our workplaces. I believe in democracy in our healthcare, in our school system, neighborhoods, and in our homes. And so while yes, electoral politics is the sort of common manifestation of democratic power, I also want to be engaging people, the working class and the poor in particular, in building their own power in these spaces that are not normally considered democratic, but in order to root out the many nefarious fingers of capitalism, I think we have to be talking about things like tenant organizing associations, like student groups, like the PTA, like the school board, all of these many manifestations of where politics pursues us in our life, and we are told that that is just life, and that politics is just our vote.
Well, finally, you mentioned going up against the people who have the power and have had it for some time. One of those people is Roger Williams, the current Republican incumbent. Apparently, one of the wealthiest members of Congress, a former used car salesman, so great reputation there. It seems like an odd match for the district, considering the nature of Austin and of the people that live there. So talk to me about differentiating yourself, which seems like it won't be difficult, from the current incumbent.
Roger Williams, in addition to everything that you have just listed, which always blows my mind and is sort of the caricature of the rich politician, Roger Williams claims to be representing the working class of District 25. He claims to have roots here, and actually he inherited his business and does not come out and talk with people on the ground until he is absolutely forced to do so. Most of the time, it's closed door fundraising parties. Yeah. And when we look at Roger Williams' donors, it's Goldman Sachs, it's Wells Fargo. It is land developers, mortgage insurance companies, and banks. Mm-hmm. And he speaks for them in his policy. So what I intend to do and what we are doing on the trail every single day is pointing out that good policy is not something that comes from a party alliance. Good policy is judged on how it affects the people, and talking to folks in places like Lampasas and Killeen, these more rural areas that have been red for a very long time, and not talking to them about, well, your Republican identity, but your identity as a person who is struggling, whose local hospital has been shut down, and who is making those choices for you, and how come you don't have a voice to affect that. Really just drawing lines and showing receipts for the first time in a really long time.
Okay, well, very exciting candidacy. Like I said, I lived in Austin for a number of years. Still have a strong connection to it, and so you seem like a great fit for my memory of what the area is like. He's a strong incumbent, obviously, but I wish you the best of luck in your challenge against him, Heidi.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you. We're gonna take a short break here. When we come back, just a little bit more to close out the show.
I think she's a politician in the worst sense of the word, okay? And what I mean by that is there are more poor people than rich people, so she's trying to appeal to the larger group.
Okay, so that is billionaire Leon Cooperman, who is on the news every day because he's a billionaire, and so he gets to be on the news and you don't. That's the way it works, weirdly enough. And there he's attacking Elizabeth Warren, which he's been doing for some time. But really what he's attacking is progressive tax reform, effectively. He could be doing it about Bernie Sanders just as well. Bernie Sanders has an even stronger wealth tax, which we'll get into is the biggest issue for Leon Cooperman. But first, I love that first point that he makes, that she's just being a politician. These progressives, they're doing what everyone always does. They've recognized that there are more poor people than rich people, so they're just giving them whatever they want. When has that ever been how American politicians act? I would argue that's still not how they act. They have always tried to appeal to the very few who have the most resources. That has been the story of American politics on both sides, both parties, for a very, very long time. That is fundamentally what bothers Leon Cooperman, the idea that a politician would dare to aim for the highest office in the land and to have no interest whatsoever in what he thinks about it. He's never experienced that before, ever in his life, and he's obviously chafing at it this first time. But to the substance of the issues with taxation, here's what he says.
But the reality is, what is the purpose of vilifying successful people that have done well for society? I don't get it. She could say that wealthy people should pay more in taxes. I happen to agree with that. They should be paying more, and they are paying more. And if they want to raise the taxes on the wealthy, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But the wealth tax is a stillborn idea.
Okay, so immediately there's an issue there where he's saying, I have no problem with paying more taxes. I actually think they should pay more taxes, but a wealth tax, that is a huge issue. And that you're gonna find every time Leon Cooperman goes on TV, you're gonna find that constantly restated. I don't mind paying more taxes, but this is a non-starter. Not that the numbers are wrong or implementation needs to be talked about some more. It's that you can tax me, but don't touch my wealth ever. And he's going to have a little bit more on that. In part, he's responding to his past appearance on the news about a week ago where he broke down in tears over the idea of a wealth tax. Here he is responding to that.
Mr. Buffer will say this publicly because he has said it already. When I took the giving pledge, I told him, if you're talking to wealthy people, asking for half isn't asking for enough. And I told him I intend to give all my money away. So I'm not crying over my personal income tax liability. I'm distressed over the dialogue. Why villainize wealthy people? Bill Gates has done a lot for society. Yeah. David Rubenstein has done a lot for society. Jeff Bezos has done a lot for society. They should be complimented, not criticized. And the wealth tax makes no sense.
Yeah, so that's where you go too far. It's one thing to say Bill Gates has done good for society. He has done some good for society. And I'm sure that if you looked at the other names that he listed, including Bezos, you could find some good too. But Bezos also effectively lives in a gigantic castle made of gold while his employees have to hold it in because they don't get breaks to go to the bathroom. So I'm going to hold off on the compliments just a little bit. And as we always say, if you have a lot, I'm going to judge what you give based on that. If Spider-Man stopped one mugging a year, I'm not going to applaud him on New Year's because he could have done a lot more. And when you have billions of dollars, if you do a few nice things, but you hoard your wealth while people all around you are going to bed hungry, they don't have a chance to get an education, they'll never own a home. And if you've manipulated politics in a way that you've produced that system, then sure, it's nice when you do a bit of charity, but I'm not gonna spend my day cheering for you. I'm going to hold the applause until something more significant comes along, and that something more significant is a wealth tax, because the scam that's being played here, and it's great if he wants to eventually give away a bunch of his money, but only taxing their income means that you can set the taxes effectively however you want. They will get ever richer. That's what we've seen, and that's what they're afraid of. Not paying a little bit more in taxes, but a fundamental shift that gets to the heart of it, which is their accrued wealth over one or more generations. Okay, that's unfortunately all the time we have. Thank you so much for watching throughout this show. Obviously a lot more planned this week. Jared Jackson's gonna be joining us tomorrow, so you're certainly going to want to tune in for that. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Damage Report. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, John Adarola. I'll see you soon.